Welcome back to Rings and Realms. We're with you again and on to the final episode of this initial 3-episode drop. It's been a long expected and exciting journey for all of us, but wow, it's been a long haul and we've been working nearly round the clock to get these out to you.
And of course, we need to thank our supporters at Kickstarter who helped fund this season. We are loving the chat on the exclusive behind-the-scenes Discord. Your thoughts and your questions, they're just fantastic, and they really help us develop each segment of analysis, so please keep it coming.
Yeah, if you'd like to join us, you can still pledge at Rings and Realms on Kickstarter, and your pledge can bring even more amazing segments to the show and give you access to our exclusive Discord. You could get a question answered on the show, you could come to the filming of our special at the end of the season, or you could even join the backstage production team as a producer.
So, with our realms well established and the rings literally taking shape, we once again have a lot to explore in this episode. You ready for this?
Let's do it. All right, let's do a quick review of what we know about Numenor. The island, settled by the elf friends of old, rose to wealth and glory and technological advancement of a kind unknown in Middle-earth. Over time, they came to resent the elves, because they were envious of the elves' long life. That envy still shines through in their current anti-elf rhetoric. They were a kingdom of wealth, but also of peace, and although they have a strong tradition of sea travel, they have no real military tradition. Why should they? The world was at peace. Their island was inaccessible to any enemy. In the early days of their glory, they sailed much and therefore journeyed to Middle-earth, establishing peaceful colonies there. We don't know for sure, but I bet that in that time they freely shared their technology with the surviving men of Middle-earth and were revered by them. However, after the resentment against elves grew stronger, the Númenorians began to isolate themselves, sailing now only to patrol their own seas and going no longer to Middle-earth. Their old colonies, like Palantir, fell into ruin and disrepair at least hundreds of years ago. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, though, if there were other colonies down in Umbor. They have become more and more anti-elf, even semi-dethroning the last king, who tried to turn his people back to their friendship with the elves and reverence for the Valar. Nevertheless, there remains a subculture of Númenorians still attached to their traditional and almost mythological past, the Faithful. Apparently, they are based in West Numenor, though we haven't seen that yet. It isn't exactly illegal to be one of the Faithful, but it's not a good idea to announce it if you are in any kind of leadership position. As Tar Palantir found, that leads to a special kind of unpopularity. So what's up next for our Númenorian friends? What does our book knowledge of Numenor lead us to expect? Well, political relations are slated to decline. Tension between the elf friends and the elf unfriends is going to intensify considerably. When the no-elf party rises to power, which seems fairly imminent, being known to be one of the Faithful is likely to become actually illegal. They are due to become a military power. We saw their first gestures at that in the last season. I suspect they'll get better at it. I also suspect that their increase of military power will correlate with a break in their isolationist policies. As Pharazon already hinted last season, a return to Middle-earth in order to levy tribute upon the natives would be extremely profitable. And, once you're levying tribute, it's a small step to slavery. The Rings of Power has brought us into the latter days of Numenor, but the overall trajectory of Tolkien's Númenorian narrative is quite recognizable. The coronation of Miriel showcases many of these elements. Now, hang on. I know it's not, of course, an actual coronation. The word coronation means crowning, and the Númenorians don't wear crowns. They use a scepter. The show is obviously well aware of this, of course. Miriel is about to take up the scepter, the equivalent of being crowned, when the Palantir hit the stairs. It's all fun and games until the Palantir hits the stairs. What is it about the Palantiri that makes them such tempting projectiles, I wonder? Anyway, they call this a coronation because English doesn't have a word for a ceremony in which one gets sceptered. Sceptrification? Maybe we should try it out and see if it'll catch on. In the meantime, I can't blame them for using the word coronation. Miriel, the Queen Regent, is the clear dynastic choice to be the ruling queen of Numenor. Yes, in Tolkien's Numenor, daughters become ruling queens. It's a whole thing, and maybe we'll talk about the history of that more someday. For now, the most important thing is that everyone in Numenor considers Miriel the obvious successor to the dead king, her father, even those people who would quite like someone else to be in charge. To say her father was unpopular would be an understatement, and her relation to her father is the primary cloud that hangs over her potential rule. Is she, like her father, going to try to pull Numenor back into its past, to its old allegiances and friendships? Or is she going to roll with the Numenorian tide and look towards the future? Pharazon gives her this choice explicitly when offering her her choice of color to be sceptered in: white for the past, or red, the color of Numenor's future. The fact that red happens to be Pharazon's own clothing shade of choice is no doubt a coincidence. The association of future Numenor with the color of blood and the color of the setting sun as it sinks ineluctably beneath the waves is, by contrast, not a coincidence. Miriel chooses the past, like her father, but she is in many ways very different from her father. She's blind, for one thing. That might seem a silly thing to say, but it's very significant when we remember that her father's name, Palantir, means the far-sighted. He saw the future and turned to the past because of it. Miriel used to be trying to do her father's work, just, with diplomacy and tact. Her blindness, however, changes things. Miriel does not see the future anymore. She has lost her sight, she has lost her seeing stone, and she has lost her far-seeing father. Notice what she gains, however. Miriel gains touch. She has gained heart. When the grieving mother slaps her at the king's funeral, she doesn't lash out or cry out. She accepts and forgives her grief and anger, and she reaches out and draws the woman into an embrace. Miriel was always a deft politician, and she's been walking a delicate line with agility for many years. But now that she's blind, she seems to see into people's hearts more clearly. Her bonding with Elendil in the ship on the way home already suggested it. Her reaction to anger and rejection and her patience win over the people, at least temporarily. After her performance at the funeral, her enemies are sent back to the drawing board. Fortunately for her enemies, Pharazon's son has a new girlfriend who carries her own drawing board around with her. Arondir is furious with Miriel for the apparent death of Isildur. Now, I admit, it's a little hard for me to understand this. I can understand Arondir being grieved, but why is she so fixated on Miriel? Why doesn't she blame her dad, who was his captain? Why doesn't she blame Isildur himself? She saw him volunteer. Arondir's determination to overthrow the current Numenorian regime single-handed is absolute and steadfast. I have to admit, I don't really understand it. In any case, Arondir tosses the Palantir into the crowd as if it were the apple of discord and throws everything into chaos. Elendil tries to take control of the situation, and indirectly of his daughter, and he simply bounces off the Palantir. Nothing can prevent the moment of decision for Miriel. She is pushed to a bald public declaration. Will she disown this evidence of her ties to her father's slightly wild-eyed adherence to the old elf-loving ways of Numenor, or will she embrace it? The role of the Palantir in the Numenor story has been a curious one. Its physical placement in the center of the Hall of Awesome Artifacts of the First Age makes it a focal point in the connection between Numenor and its founding. The fact that it is made by and associated with the elves also makes it an important symbol of the ancient connection between Numenor and the elves. The particular connection between the Palantir and Palantir, Miriel's dad, are fairly plain though. Miriel does not disown the Palantir. When push comes to shove and all diplomacy is out the window, she knows where the great new future for Numenor that Pharazon envisions leads, to a watery grave for everyone. In the culminating moment, we get a confused semi-intervention from the Valar. An eagle of Manwë shows up, demonstrating the blessing of the Valar on the sceptrification of Miriel. Pharazon, thinking quickly, seizes the photo op, posing dramatically in front of the frankly annoyed-looking eagle. Now, like all eagles are apparently trained to do from the day they are hatched, this eagle shows up dramatically at the very moment when all hope seems lost. And yet, the rescue he seems to have come to perform, political rather than physical, fails. since it's misinterpreted by the people. Now, one might ask, why doesn't the eagle clarify the matter? Eagles in Tolkien are in general perfectly capable of speech, but this one stays mum and just flies off in disgust, presumably to deliver a blistering report back to Manwë. I don't believe the lack of speech by the eagle is an oversight. I think this is a deliberate choice. I don't mean on the part of the showrunners, I mean on the part of the eagle and of Manwë himself. Tolkien says that the eagles in Numenor are often called the observers of Manwë. I believe that the eagle did show up to endorse Miriel, but that its appearance is also a test. The Valar are not intervening to determine the event, to interject themselves into the politics of Numenor. It's a test. How will they respond? Pharazon spoke of an eagle's appearance being received as an omen. Will they receive the omen, even if the omen points against the stream of the people's mood? Or will they wrest the omen to their own preferred meaning, manipulating it to confirm their own desires? I'm pretty sure I know what the eagle is going to be reporting on that one. This is a very bad sign for Numenor, but note that we are still a long way from the end of the road. It could have been a lot worse. Someday, the Númenorians will ignore and reject the messengers of the Valar entirely. Pharazon might have put that sword to other use.
I wanted to take a look at the coronation scene. We open with a bell tolling. Miriel enters from the left and moves forward into the frame all in white. She's then framed dead center in the shot at the top of a flight of stairs. All of this signals ceremony. It's formal. She's all in white. She's in this position of power up high. It's very traditional, and it's kind of a bit restrained. Although she's in power and moving forward in the frame, it just feels odd. It's different than we've seen her before, and I think that matches the unsettled feeling that she probably has as she assumes the throne. She then descends down the golden steps, lowering, falling, and doing so blindly, and she even manages to stare down Pharazon blindly. The music here is full of major tones. It's bright and it's powerful. She rises up the steps and goes on to the coronation stage, but then she's out of focus on the stage. She wavers a bit as she hesitantly steps towards the scepter-like object. Then we have this visual tension happening. It's going back and forth from her in power to out of power. As an example, there's this slight up angle with the camera here showing her in power, but not powerful. She's smaller than the man next to her. She looks almost diminutive and set back. She then reasserts her position in that speech, but it's not really visually cued to us yet. She's still very small. She's left of center, and she's smaller than the man next to her. It almost looks like she's a full step down from him. It doesn't feel very powerful, and it doesn't look like she's in control. She does make this powerful speech, and it connects her to her subjects, and the camera swoops in on her, giving this close-up shot with an up angle in her strong moment. But then, we have our major interruption, and a real turning point for Miriel's future. Eärien shouts, "For Isildur!" Then in swoops Eärien. She's up very high on the opposite steps on the left side of the frame. She's counter to Miriel on the far corner. Miriel low, Eärien high, with the fire between them. Eärien, Elendil, and Pharazon all now have shots where they are the center of the frame as they introduce that Queen of Lies idea, and her being controlled by that elf stone. Miriel throughout this is silent until she defends the Palantir. And now her position is destroyed. The camera is far back. She's not taking up the frame at all, and it'd actually be difficult to find her if she wasn't wearing that white outfit. She's reaching out to nothing. There's no saving hand for her to grasp because Elendil cannot get close enough. Then there's a shift. The focus changes as the citizens turn around. Numenor is centered, and we have this point of view camera through the eyes of the eagle arriving at the coronation. Miriel seems hopeful at their arrival, but she's dead silent. But Pharazon then moves from the left side of the frame into the center. He is the one moving forward and then staring directly at us and walking forward and at the eagle. Pharazon takes center frame. There's a warm light, the camera is angled up slightly, and this is placing him in that position of power. The eagle's confused. He's looking back and forth, who am I going to put my allegiance with? And he opens his wings up in this confusion. But instead of confusion, it looks like political propaganda. It looks like a real position of power. Pharazon is framed in front of him and draws his sword as the music swells, signifying his shift into a position of glorious power. As the eagle departs, Pharazon is framed by that half-circle arch. The sun is rising behind him, and his sword is drawn powerfully. Miriel takes a step back. She has been dethroned.
In Season 1, we were reminded that the Southlands were full of humans who had served Morgoth in the Old Wars. Of course, those wars were thousands of years ago now, but then elvish memories do not dim, as Arondir reminds us. When the crisis happens and the orcs invade, the humans of the Southlands are left with a choice of roads. Some stay with Bronwyn and Arondir, and some follow Waldreg and go to try their luck with the orcs. This choice split the humans up into two groups, those who resisted the orcs and those who collaborated with them. The resistance soon found themselves on the side of the Númenorians and of Galadriel, while most of the collaborators got slaughtered. Now, the resistance also had a true king of the Southlands foisted on them too. I assume we'll be coming back to that at some point later on in this season. Sauron's little Moses impersonation, standing in front of Adar and saying, "Let my people go," certainly suggests that he is not done posing as the king of the Southlanders. Anyway, in Season 2, the situation in the Southlands is a little more complicated. The old two sides still exist. The resistance is now established at Pelargir. Pelargir is the ruin of an old Númenorian colony, which is fitting for them. This clearly reflects the side that they chose last season. They have gone from being the old allies of Morgoth to the allies of Queen Miriel and Numenor, just waiting around for her to return as she promised. The collaborators still exist as a category, even though the only one of the actual collaborators from last season who is still alive, briefly, is Waldreg. He is busy securing oaths of obedience to Adar, however. The brand of Adar is the symbol of collaboration. By the way, notice the uncomfortable parallel here? Who else in this season, so far, is in a parallel situation with the poor captive humans who are forced to collaborate with the evil overlord or die? According to Elrond, all of Lindon. In order to avoid the fating, they have taken up the Rings of Power and are collaborating with Sauron. The rings are, to Elrond, as bad as Adar's brand. Worse in a way, because Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Círdan are being active in their collaboration, rather than mere victims. Their captivity, Elrond fears, is just as real, though the chains might not yet be visible. But anyway, as I was saying before, the situation in the Southlands is a bit more complicated now. Adar told Halbrand that he had, in fact, let the people go. Sure enough, when we get back to the Southlands in episode 3, we find not chained slaves, but groups of humans living rough on the fringes in camps in the woods. They all bear the brand of Adar, but they no longer seem to be actively collaborating with the orcs, but living on their own. The non-Pelargir segment of the humans of the Southlands all bear the brand of Adar, but they no longer belong anywhere. The people of Pelargir don't trust them. The orcs don't want them. They are no longer slaves, but they are now outcasts, dismissed as wild men. Episode 3 provides us with a representative sampling of characters from this area. Theo represents the people of Pelargir. He is the possibly, well, at least apparently, orphaned child of the old Southlands. Like him, the people of Pelargir are a small, surviving remnant of their people, cut off from the homes and the families they've known. Theo also needs to decide what he is going to be. Galadriel gave him her sword and said he could be a soldier. Arondir says that he could take his mother's place and be a healer. So Theo is grieving for dead kin, wishing to be a soldier, not yet at least wanting to be a healer, and his outlook is increasingly nihilistic. Perhaps we should call him Durnhelm. Like him, his people are also caught between hope and despair, and they have no plan or purpose yet. Isildur represents the new Númenorians. They came confidently to Middle-earth, thinking they would make a difference. Isildur was extremely eager to be included, to distinguish himself, and to find a land where he belongs. None of that works out, as he or any of them anticipated. The dorky and naive Ontamo, his friend, is dead, like the death of the innocents of Numenor. Elendil, his other friend, is now a hardened soldier who looks like he's going to be the first up against the wall when the revolution comes in Numenor. Isildur himself starts the episode with the idea that things are going to be as usual, that he can just find his old life. He expects his father is going to be waiting for him. Instead, he finds himself actually abandoned. Well, except for his horse, naturally. The Southlanders are living in a Númenorian ruin. The Numenor of old that built the city originally is gone, lost even in Numenor. Isildur was discontented with Numenor as it had become. He wanted something more. Now Isildur is the link between the two cultures. He, meanwhile, is getting connected with Estrid, who represents the wild men. Estrid, hiding from orcs among the wreckage of battle, gleaning materials for survival from the ruins of a Númenorian troop, could be an allegory for the scattered and wandering humans of the Second or Third Ages. Her only identity is that she has escaped from Mordor and survived. She claims to be searching for her missing loved ones, but she sounds like she might be trying to fool someone about that, perhaps even herself. Continued survival seems to be her priority. She bears the brand of Adar on the back of her neck, but she is not evil, just a survivor in a world that is suddenly very hard. Given a chance at acceptance, she's eager to take it. When last we see her, she is reinventing herself, going through a rebranding process. Will the wild men do the same? Finally, there is Arondir. Arondir has lost Bronwyn, and he blames himself, doubly, no doubt. He blames himself for her death, as he failed to heal her of her wound or prevent its festering. At the same time, he finds himself in exactly the position he spoke with his friend about at the beginning of Season 1. Relationships between elves and mortals can, in general, with only a very few exceptions, and in only one way. His grief for Bronwyn's death does not lead him to abandon the people of the Southlands, though. Arondir's love for Bronwyn and his care for the mortals over whom he was set to watch were always bound closely together. It seems in the end that his fighting for the mortals was not just derivative of his love for Bronwyn. Bronwyn is gone, but his care remains. Arondir is the only Sylvan elf in a cast full of Noldor, and he is also the only elf besides Elrond who seems to care much at all about anyone other than elves. These four characters, the future ally of Gondor, the wild woman of the outskirts, the Sylvan elf, and the lost Númenorian who is exiled now in Middle-earth, cut off from return to his island paradise, which he now misses, although he thought it was a bit of a drag when he was there, are a representative sample not only of the Southlands, but of Rovanion in the Third Age. This plot shows us what happens to all the other people, the ones who are not elf lords or dwarf kings or wizards or mighty demagogues of Numenor. What role will these others play in the great events? How will they be shaped by the actions of the great? And how will they shape them? When Durin and Disa show up to Eregion in response to Celebrimbor's letter, they are offered an exchange and then temptation. Celebrimbor has no intention to take advantage of their troubles, just to render aid. Look at Celebrimbor, using those rings of power to do good in the world. His earnestness is tragic. Notice that Sauron has his back turned on them and is walking away from them all as Celebrimbor talks about that, physically distancing himself from Celebrimbor's quite sincere offer. Celebrimbor offers them power to heal their mountain, and he explicitly parallels that with the healing of the great tree in Lindon. Celebrimbor seems to agree with King Durin in thinking that the mountain is being afflicted by a power from outside it. Just as the black tendrils of corruption were destroying the tree, so the darkness enclosing the mountain is destroying it. Both need to be healed. Celebrimbor seems really to want to help the dwarves, but notice the moral gap we can already see between Celebrimbor and Durin and Disa. Celebrimbor clearly thinks that they will jump at the offer of power, especially the power to heal their mountain. But instead, we see something quite lovely. When Celebrimbor mentions the great tree, which he does only to boast about the power of the rings, Durin and Disa look at each other in excitement. Durin is not thinking of power, nor even of their mountain. He's thinking about his friend. Not only has his friend's life and the lives of his people been saved, but they themselves helped to make it happen. The joy and satisfaction that Durin and Disa share when they hear this news lies completely outside the framework of how Celebrimbor is thinking, or assuming that they will think. This gap between Durin's mindset and the current thinking of the Eregion Brain Trust becomes more painfully obvious when Annatar enters the conversation. Once again, the approach is premised on power. This time, he tries to tempt Durin with a way to regain his inheritance, thinking that would be an inducement. When Durin is resistant, Annatar tries his con artist routine again. Durin mentions Elrond, so Annatar speaks confidently as if he knows Elrond well, and conveys a message to Durin, thinking to increase Durin's confidence further by flattery. Both attempts fail completely, raising Durin's suspicions rather than increasing his confidence in Annatar. So why does Annatar fail so totally in his temptation of Durin? For one thing, he does not really understand friendship. Durin and Elrond's friendship is the strongest in the show. If Sauron understood the kind of closeness that Durin and Elrond have, he would have known not to try that particular bluff. For another thing, though, it also shows that he does not really understand the dwarves. We spent a lot of time with Durin and Elrond in Season 1, and we saw many examples of elvish flowery speech and dwarf roughness rubbing against each other's grain. We know now how a dwarf like Durin reacts to fancy speeches. Enough with the quail sauce, Annatar, honestly. When Elrond got all diplomatic and Durin cut him off, we saw Elrond adjust. And over the course of the season, we saw him deal with the dwarves more in their own language. As soon as we hear Annatar's fancy flattery and we see Durin's hilariously unconvinced expression, we know exactly what Durin is thinking and why. By the way, Durin's skeptical face turns out to be even better than Elrond's skeptical face. Sauron, however, does not understand what Durin's thinking, and he fails to adjust like Elrond did. Sauron knows how to con humans, and he knows how to con elves, but he just does not know this particular mark well enough, it seems. This is really interesting because of what we learn in The Lord of the Rings about the Seven. Sauron intended for the Seven and the Nine to enslave their wearers completely. The design worked with the Nine, and the ring wraiths were the result. But the design failed with the dwarves. The stubbornness and the hardness of the dwarves was something that Sauron apparently miscalculated. And the result was that the rings failed to dominate the dwarves completely, though they affected them. This is why Sauron ultimately puts a recall notice out on the Seven. They don't function as well as he hoped they would. Sauron's poor market research on the dwarf segment of his Rings of Power customer base is already showing, even in this first interaction with Durin and Disa. Now, Sauron still has the dwarves by the short hairs. As Disa points out, they can't afford to turn away from anything that might have even a small hope of solving their big problem. The need of the dwarves is going to lead to the acceptance of the rings, but the shaky start to the negotiations is very important. But, speaking of healing the mountains, let's talk for a moment about the reconciliation of Durin and his father. Remember that in episode 2, I was talking about how the story of Durin and the king and Disa paralleled the larger story of Khazad-dûm as a whole. In the previous scene, Durin is still asserting his stubbornness both in front of Annatar and to Disa afterwards. But the first scene we get when we return to Khazad-dûm is of Prince Durin relenting. He stands before his father, looks him in the eye, and then bows his head, indicating his submission. Something fairly momentous has just happened. The standoff between the Durins was parallel to the mountain's refusal to hear the stone singers. Prince Durin's act of humility feels like the relenting of the mountain itself. This act alone doesn't actually solve the mountain problem, but it seems almost to give hope that the mountain could be healed without the ring. If the Durins can be reconciled, maybe the mountain also can be reached somehow. And it's in the context of this reconciliation that Prince Durin both relays Celebrimbor's offer and also advises against it. Remember how out of sync with Durin, Disa, and Elrond the offer of Celebrimbor and the attempted manipulation of Sauron seemed. Now, in the context of the reconciliation of the Durins, that Eregion gambit feels even more out of place. In the last episode, I talked a good deal about means and ends when discussing the elves and their rings. The temptation to use questionable or even immoral means in order to attain noble or beneficial ends is often present in Tolkien's works, and giving in to that temptation is never a good idea. This is the problem at the heart of Elrond's discomfort with the three rings. Elrond keeps being told that the elves' intentions are pure, and that they can achieve wonderful things with the rings. And Elrond keeps saying right back that if the means you use to attain those goals are wrong, then it doesn't matter. Remember when Saruman tried to convince Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings that allying themselves with the Dark Lord instead of fighting him would not actually involve a change in their goals, only in their means? Prince Durin suspects that the dwarves are facing a similar situation. Durin knows that the goal of saving his people and saving Khazad-dûm is a good thing, obviously. But he also suspects that Annatar is lying to him about the rings, and that the offer of the seven is not what it seems. Is it wise to pursue a dubious course, just in the outside chance it will accomplish the good thing you are desperate for? Durin even reverses his earlier position on helping the elves. He admits that when King Durin said that perhaps it was wrong for the elves to try to cheat death, he might have had a point. Now that he is not blinded by the emotional urgency of seeing his friend drowning in front of him, to use his metaphor, he begins to think that he might have been rash before. His words show that he now sees that his desire to help his friend survive, a very good end, was leading him to follow dubious means, and that this wasn't right and wouldn't have good results. Keep in mind that this is a huge admission for Durin to make. The primary cause of his stubbornness before was that he felt himself to be right, and he wouldn't back down from that. And it was exactly this point that he was insisting he was right about. Remember, he says to Disa in episode 2 that if his father had taken the bargain that Elrond had offered, the dwarves would not be at risk of starvation. But the king possibly no longer feels the same conviction he did before. He was saying in season 1 that if the Valar have determined that the time has come for the elves to fade and perish, that was that, and they shouldn't try to cheat death. Now the shoe is on the other foot, and it's the dwarves who face death. Will King Durin now say the same about his own people? Will he say that the mountain has chosen, and they shouldn't try to cheat death? I rather doubt it. Prince Durin now seems to incline that way, or at least to wait and see if there's another and less sketchy means to try to achieve that end. We should notice the closely similar positions in which the show has placed Elrond and Durin. Both oppose the rings, and for the same means and ends-based reasoning. Even from afar, Durin and Elrond are still side by side.
We talk a lot about visual storytelling and the language of film on Other Minds and Hands and on Rings and Realms. The techniques used are impactful and powerful, but they can also be really tricky to grasp. And often it's this showing or hearing something that grates against our expectations from the words that we love from our beloved books. It's different, and therefore it's wrong. Not quite. Yes, it's different. And isn't it neat that we can tell a story in a different way? There's a great scene in episode 3 between Prince and King Durin that really beautifully illustrates the ability of visual and audio storytelling that I want to discuss with you here. So we start this scene in a disgruntled, panicked, upset Khazad-dûm corridor. It's lit by lanterns as they no longer have any natural light piped in. The merchants are all frustrated, they're scared, and they're preparing to petition the king for action. In summary, the tone laid as the foundation for this scene is dark, full of upset, anger, crankiness. This is our starting point. We think that the merchants are about to be let in, but instead, we see hesitant Boots approach the throne from the right side of the frame. Now, because he's coming from the right side, it's kind of like he's walking backwards, back into the room, right? He's going from right to left. So he's going back into this royal space and into his father's presence. And then the king is slightly left on that shot, a slightly left of center. So he's not totally squared up. He's just a bit off. So all of this feels a little unsettling still, but we're curious. The camera then pans up, and we see a close-up, squarely framed of the prince. The prodigal son returns. His approach is slow, he's silent, His head is bowed. This could be a show of shame, of deference, submission, probably stubbornness. Prince Durin is at the bottom of this steep set of stairs that rise in a pyramid path to King Durin up above. The perfectly centered shot with the triangle shape in the center focuses our attention as the viewers on that hierarchy. The lowly prince below, the high and mighty king above. The scene here needs absolutely no dialogue. Everything in their actions, the music, the lighting, the geometric designs point us towards the story being told. They understand each other. They're coming together. He bows. And then we cut to Durin, and they are figuring it out together on equal footing at the same level. But the dialogue of that second part actually starts while we're still in the throne room in that first part. So some of the power and the setting of that foundation carries over into this second scene, where they work together to figure it out. And I love this scene, the dialogue of this scene where Prince Durin is so open with his father, saying, "You might have been right. I don't know if I trust this." That would not have landed as well if we didn't have the strength of the foundation laid in the previous scene. The tone of disgruntled citizens coming to the king's space, having a slow, tentative, cautious rise towards hopeful reconciliation, then lays this foundation for their conversation to make progress. Really important, and I think fully based on the visual storytelling of that otherwise silent scene that came previously.
Episode 3 gives us the first glimpse of Sauron and Celebrimbor actually working together on the Rings of Power project. The most momentous step that we see Celebrimbor take down the road to his destruction is not part of the negotiations with Durin and Disa, but in the letter he sits down to write afterwards. One of Sauron's very first moves in his deception of Celebrimbor, remember, had been to start dividing him from both Galadriel and Gil-galad. Remember Halbrand's us and they in that first conversation? Now, Sauron pushes Celebrimbor to the next step by intimating that Gil-galad does not approve of helping the dwarves, and in fact opposes making any more rings. The layers of manipulation here are complex. First, he undermines Gil-galad's moral authority by painting him as a narrow-minded bigot who does not share Celebrimbor's generous scope of vision for saving all Middle-earth. This in turn strokes Celebrimbor's ego again, painting him as the most kind, the most good, and the most wise. That must be why Annatar, sent from the Valar to aid Middle-earth, left Lindon behind and came to Celebrimbor instead. And then, of course, he invited Celebrimbor to take the next step. Gil-galad has forbidden Celebrimbor to make any more rings, he says. Under all these circumstances, it would be noble and virtuous to defy the orders of the High King. And Celebrimbor walks right into it. The writing of the letter is a huge step. It represents the first time in this whole process that Celebrimbor has actually done something that, at the time of doing it, he knew to be wrong. He lies to Gil-galad about the rings. His intentions are still not bad, but the means he will utilize to achieve those ends have now crossed a crucial moral line. Remember, by the way, the stuff I said in the last episode about the High King. The show has increased the authority of the High King. Defying him or lying to him is in this context a doubly big deal. Notice that the rationale Celebrimbor uses to excuse his lie is that it is not Gil-galad's business what he does in his own realm. That might in a sense be true in the Silmarillion, but it's not true in the show. Remember also what I said about Celebrimbor and Feanor. When the Valar ask Feanor to give up the Silmarils in order to save the trees, he refuses, and his selfishness and resistance leads him immediately afterwards to rebellion against the authority of the Valar. It is significant that we are seeing Celebrimbor lapse into rebellion also. He is choosing his precious works of craft over submission to authority. Instead of reversing Feanor's choice, as he was before, Celebrimbor is now following in Grandpa's footsteps, and that is not a good thing. Episode 3 also contains another important first, Celebrimbor's first resistance of Annatar. We see a small rift between them when Celebrimbor overrules Annatar at the end of Durin's visit. Disa has just asked for a wee bit of time to consider, and Sauron was about to keep the pressure on. It sounds like Sauron was not going to let them leave until he had closed the sale. Celebrimbor cuts across him, however, granting the dwarves their time and letting them leave. Celebrimbor, of course, is quite right. Had Sauron tried to pressure Durin would surely have dug in and never agreed. Once again, Sauron shows his ignorance of dwarves. Celebrimbor knows them better. The more revealing moment, however, comes at the actual forging of the Seven. The dwarves deliver the mithril to Celebrimbor, and he is going to add it to the stew, the final ingredient. The entire exchange is completely nonverbal. Celebrimbor stands before King Durin, looming over him a little ominously. Durin presents the mithril, and Celebrimbor reaches out and takes it. He is then walking over to the cauldron to place it in the mix when he's confronted by Annatar. Annatar blocks his way silently, holding out his hand. Celebrimbor, of his own will, places it in his hand. Sauron closes his eyes and concentrates, clearly infusing this mithril with his own power. That Sauron should choose the mithril as the vehicle of his corruption of the rings is particularly interesting, and we'll see what comes of that. Meanwhile, we can see that Celebrimbor is uncomfortable. He did not expect Annatar to hijack that moment. He looks at Sauron with suspicion for the first time, though he tries to cover it up. The awkward smiles and fidgeting with which Celebrimbor and Annatar stand next to each other in the final shot of this episode are eloquent. Celebrimbor is not okay anymore. He has left the path, and he's beginning to realize it. Episode 3 introduces us to our first troll in the Rings of Power, the truly enormous Damrod. The hugeness of this troll is important. As I've mentioned before, Tolkien depicted almost everything in his world as diminishing over time. Everything in the Third Age is smaller and lesser than parallel things in the Second or First Ages. The Rings of Power has made an effort to depict this at several points, and Damrod the Troll is certainly a noteworthy example. Trolls are always big, but Damrod is gigantic. He is the kind of troll that will someday become a legend. Bert, Tom, and Bill from The Hobbit are only faint echoes of him. Damrod's name is interesting, in that it is Sindarin. You might recognize it as the name of one of the Rangers of Ithilien who find Frodo and Sam in the Two Towers. Personally, I suspect the name is what Adar calls him, rather than the name his troll mama gave him, which is why it's a Sindarin name. It is apt enough, meaning metal hammer, or perhaps beat metal. And speaking of metal, I love the heavy metal theme of Damrod, the track called rather comically The Ballad of Damrod. The harsh metal sound in 5/4 with heavy percussion seems just right for a legendary troll. One of these days, I will have time to do a close analysis of the lyrics of the ballad, which are a fun mashup of Sam's troll song from The Fellowship of the Ring and the Goblin Town song from The Hobbit. But not today. It is, of course, no coincidence that we are introduced to trolls and Ents in the same episode. Okay, technically we are only introduced to the Ents rather indirectly, it's true. The fact that the woodcutter who is conspicuously chopping that great tree with an axe through the whole outlaw scene was the first to get nabbed by the unseen attacker of the camp was a fairly clear signal. Anyway, Ents and trolls are connected to each other, as Treebeard explains in the Two Towers. Treebeard says that trolls were made by Morgoth in mockery of Ents, as orcs were of elves. That, of course, gets us right back into the orc origins question, which I won't go into again now. The important point is the link between Ents and trolls, and the Rings of Power appears to be picking up on this with the parallels in Episode 3. Notice that both Damrod the Troll and the as yet unseen but presumably Entish figure wrecking the outlaw camp are both given entrances in the same episode, and introduced to one of the central characters. Keep your eye on this parallel, and let's see how that develops. When Elendil tries to pick up the Palantir in Episode 3, he is unexpectedly zapped and thrown across the room by it. Now, I don't pretend to understand why his reaction to touching it is so explosive, but let's reflect a bit on what we know about the Palantiri. The seeing stones, of course, are primarily used for surveillance and communication. The operator can use it to see things from afar, even things distant in time as well as space, and to communicate with the mind of another person who is also looking into a Palantir at the same time. The use of the Palantir is enormously dangerous in the Third Age because Sauron has one, and if you look into one, you will likely find the Dark Lord on the other end of the line. This is what happened to Pippin in The Lord of the Rings, of course. Now, in the Rings of Power, Sauron does not yet have one, and indeed, the other stones are hidden, presumably by the faithful out in West Numenor, where they keep all the coolest elvish toys. Galadriel said she had looked into one before, remember, so we know they exist. There is no hint that even Miriel or Tar Palantir, her father, ever used the Palantir to communicate with anyone. The Palantir that they have seems to be a special one. It is set permanently to the future, and it just shows the same thing, no matter how you focus your will. The interesting thing is that there is a Palantir in The Lord of the Rings that fits that description. There is a stone set on a tower in the west coast of Middle-earth, and it only looks back across the sea at Numenor and does nothing else. The even more interesting thing is that Palantir is called the Elendil stone, because it was set there by Elendil, and he was the one who went there in order to look through it to Numenor that was, and which he would never see again. Since last season, I have loved the idea that the Palantir of Miriel would turn out to be that stone. If it keeps just showing the drowning of Numenor on repeat indefinitely, it would still provide a way for Elendil to see Numenor again, even though he could only do so by watching its downfall again and again. Really tragic. Elendil's first encounter with this Palantir does not go well, but that's something to keep an eye on. It also seems like someone is going to have to sneak into the palace and steal back the Palantir at some point. This is also a nice Númenorian theme, but we'll come back to that one later on. When the Edain, the humans who were the allies of the elves in the First Age, were given the island of Numenor, their relationship with the Valar became complicated. They had met the glorious representatives of the Valar in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, and so their reverence for the Valar and their representatives was well established as the land of Numenor was founded. However, the Valar also decided to keep the Númenorians rather pointedly at arm's length. That may be a slightly unfair way to describe it, but it's certainly how the Númenorians came to feel about it over time. The Valar passed a rule called the Ban of the Valar that forbade the Númenorians to sail west towards Valinor. The whole ocean west of the island was a no-sail zone. Almost the only contact that the Númenorians had with the Valar was very indirect, through the elves that came to visit them occasionally. As the unrest of the Númenorians grew, they began increasingly to resent the elves in a hate-the-messenger kind of way. The elves were the representatives of the Valar and drew much of the ire that the Númenorians were not yet bold enough to aim at the Valar directly. But there was one other point of contact that the Númenorians had with the Valar, and that was the eagles. The great eagles of Manwë were his messengers and observers. There were, for instance, 3 great eagles who for a long time came and remained at the sacred place on top of the central mountain of the island, and they were called the Observers of Manwë. The point is that the eagles are going to be pivotal to the Numenor story. They are symbolically, and to some extent functionally, an extension of the Valar, and of Manwë, the Lord of the Valar in particular. As the Númenorians slide further and further into rebellion and corruption, watch their attitudes to the eagles. What we saw in the episode today will not last, I believe. One of the most daring scenes of episode 3 was the shot of the female orc holding her baby. There's a lot to unpack here. First, let's be quite clear. Orcs reproduce sexually. If they are the descendants of corrupted elves, this absolutely must be true. And as I've said several times, the Rings of Power is clearly setting out to show what that concept, suggested by Tolkien and chosen for publication by his son Christopher, actually looks like. So if this is what orcs are, then daddy orcs and mommy orcs have been coming together to have baby orcs for as long as there have been orcs. In that sense, there is nothing new here. The weird scene in Peter Jackson's movies about orcs emerging from slime can have nothing to do with orcs derived originally from elves. That scene is the one that's the problem. It's led millions of people to be confused about this simple fact. The other big issue, however, is the apparent tenderness of the family unit. The show gives us an orc mom holding her swaddled baby protectively while the orc daddy comes over to stand near them and look down on the two of them tenderly. I know that this seems deeply wrong to many viewers, and I'm not saying that I love it myself, but I would just repeat, what is happening in this show is that they are showing what the elf origin orcs might actually look like. In the books, we are told that the orcs are dominated by the will of Sauron. They are enslaved, in fact, not free to make their own choices. If they were descended from elves, they would, by theological necessity, retain their fundamental freedom of will. It's all in Aquinas. Left to themselves, they would in theory be able to make up their own minds and choose their own way, establishing their own culture, which could change and develop over time. I'm not saying you have to like the idea of even potentially kinder and gentler orcs. Neither did Tolkien, in fact. That's one of the reasons why he rejected the elf origin idea. But it's the theory that Christopher put in the Silmarillion, so it's the one that the show has chosen to depict. The idea of cultural change among the orcs is in fact the topic of this whole scene even before our attention is drawn to the mother and baby standing in the background. Adar and his orc lieutenant are talking about going to war. The lieutenant doesn't want to. He was hoping that they had seen the end of war and could settle down peacefully in their nice new home. Well, their new home, anyway. This is exactly the kind of orc culture shift that could in theory happen outside the domination of Sauron's will. Adar has been all about orc freedom from the beginning. The show isn't asking you to think that the orcs are all really nice folks on the inside. It does, however, seem to be asking that we remember that the rise of Sauron is not only a dire threat to the free peoples, but it is also the final death knell for any freedom or hope of betterment that the orcs themselves might have. It is not precisely clear how Isildur got from the smoking wreckage of Bronwyn's old village to the tunnels of Shelob. That there are giant spiders in the tunnels of the mountains on the west side of Mordor, however, makes perfect sense. Shelob is the name of the giant spider whom Frodo and Sam meet in The Lord of the Rings. She has dwelt in those tunnels age-long, we are told, and so we should have expected to find her already there. I do like the choice to place Isildur as the one to encounter the spiders. His future home, Minas Ithil, will be right next to the western entrance of Shelob's lair. It's almost as if he will build his future stronghold in that location, in part to protect people from her and her children. The orc who looks dead but springs to life is a direct reference to The Lord of the Rings. Frodo, of course, is stung by Shelob, which knocks him unconscious, and Sam thinks he's dead. The local orcs, however, know the score. Sam overhears one telling a funny story about how one of their fellow orcs got trapped by Shelob and strung up with her webs, but then he woke up, remaining helplessly bound and anticipating his eventual death when Shelob would return to eat him. Well, the other orcs thought it was a funny story anyway. The fact that Shelob drags her victims off to her lair and keeps them alive for a while seems to have been the basic link to Isildur. This explains why he was missing, but also still alive, even if it doesn't explain how the spiders fetched him all the way from the village. The narrator in The Lord of the Rings compares Shelob to Sauron's cat, and explains that Sauron sometimes gives prisoners to her and has the reports brought back to him of how she toyed with them before killing them. I doubt we've seen the end of Shelob, and I will be interested to see what relationship Sauron establishes with her when he moves in. Thanks for joining us for this analysis of Episode 3. We're ready for a nap. but also really ready for episode 4 of the Rings of Power, which drops in just a few hours. Game on, everybody!
If you're a fan of Rings and Realms, please subscribe now and consider pledging to Rings and Realms on Kickstarter. We love these engaged fans. Your observations, your ideas, they're just brilliant. And our Discord community for our Kickstarter backers has been delightful. So please come join us if you're not already there.
It's going to be great to be able to include your questions in our Q&A, bring on our guests for special segments, and see what other elements and analysis we can add to a more normal production week of Rings and Realms, if that exists. But for now, we've got to get some sleep, and drink some water, and see the sunshine, and recall the touch of grass.
I don't remember the taste of strawberries.